Everyone knows about the French Revolution's guillotine, the steel mouth that opened and closed without mercy, devouring kings, queens, and strangers plucked from the streets. It was swift, it was cold, it was final. But for the Robespierre brothers, death was not swift. It was chaos. It was bones splintering on stone, blood seeping into the cracks of Parisian cobblestones, the hush of a crowd erupting into screams. It was the revolution itself turning on its children, grinding them into dust before the eyes of the same people they once ruled. Maximilien, the incorruptible voice of terror. Augustin, the loyal shadow who followed him into power's blaze. Together, they strode across France like prophets of a new world. Together, they would be dragged into a night of smoke, betrayal, and ruin, a night history prefers to blur, a night remembered not in triumph, but in agony. This is not the polished ending written in textbooks. This is the story hidden in whispers and shadows, of jaws shattered and bodies broken, of two brothers abandoned by allies and offered up to the blade they had once commanded. You are watching Echoes of Time. If rare history grips you, subscribe now, so you never miss what others tried to forget. Maximilien Robespierre was no ordinary man. Thin, sharp-eyed, with a face carved into stern resolve, he carried himself as if morality itself had chosen him as its vessel. He was called the Incorruptible, a man who spoke of virtue with a fire that ignited crowds and silenced rivals. Where others bent, he stood unyielding. Where others compromised, he sharpened his words into weapons. He believed the revolution was not simply politics, but destiny. And for a time, France listened. Beside him walked his younger brother, Augustin. If Maximilien was cold stone, Augustin was warm light. He was younger, handsome, quick with words that charmed soldiers and citizens alike. They called him Bonbon, sweet, irresistible. A man who drew loyalty not through fear, but affection. Yet beneath his elegance, there was steel. He defended his brother fiercely, carried his cause into the provinces, and bound himself to Maximilien's shadow as if his own life were inseparable from it. Two brothers, different as fire and ice, yet bound together by blood and by belief. Maximilien dreamed of reshaping the nation into virtue incarnate. Augustin dreamed only of standing beside him as that vision took shape. But the revolution has no patience for loyalty, no mercy for love. In the furnace of politics, virtue becomes tyranny, and charm becomes guilt by association. Their strengths, once celebrated, became the very ropes that would drag them toward the scaffold. It is here, in their bond, that the tragedy begins to form. A promise of loyalty that would condemn them both, not separately, but together, in the same night, under the same blade. You are watching Echoes of Time. If stories like this stir you, tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from, because this history belongs not to one nation, but to all who dare to remember. The revolution devoured France like a fire that refused to die. Every month brought new arrests, new trials, new heads rolling into baskets before crowds that cheered and wept in the same breath. And at the heart of this storm stood Maximilien Robespierre, calm and unbending, speaking of virtue even as the guillotine claimed thousands. To his enemies, he was a tyrant cloaked in righteousness. To his followers, he was the guardian of the revolution, the incorruptible soul of a nation in chaos. But power breeds suspicion, and suspicion festers into fear. By 1794, whispers spread through the convention's corridors. Maximilien had turned from a savior into a threat. He held lists of names, names of those he deemed unworthy, corrupt, or dangerous. Every man feared his turn might come next. Even allies who once lifted him now trembled at his silence, seeing in it the shadow of their own deaths. And where Maximilien stood, Augustin stood also. The younger Robespierre had risen quickly, carrying his brother's cause into the provinces, stamping out resistance with ruthless energy. What began as loyalty now branded him an accomplice. To oppose one Robespierre was to oppose both. And so, in the eyes of their enemies, the brothers became a single beast, two heads of the same monster that had to be cut down together. The revolution had reached a fever pitch. Paris was restless, the convention anxious, and the air thick with betrayal. The people who once roared for blood now flinched at the endless slaughter. Robespierre's speeches, once cheered, now drew silence, then murmurs, then scorn. The tide was turning, and the brothers did not see how swiftly it was rising against them. All of France was waiting for them to fall, but no one expected how. You are watching Echoes of Time. If you have not subscribed yet, ask yourself why, and tell us in the comments below. Your voice is part of this story, whether you choose to stand with us or remain in the shadows. Night fell over Paris on the 9th of Thermidor. The streets, once alive with the chance of liberty, throbbed with an uneasy silence, broken only by the march of boots echoing through the dark. Inside the Hôtel de Ville, the Robespierre brothers gathered with their last allies, Georges Couthon, crippled but defiant, and Saint-Just, young, brilliant, and already marked for death. They sat in a chamber thick with smoke and fear, listening to the sound of soldiers closing in. The revolution's children had turned on their fathers. Deputies who once applauded Maximilien now shouted for his arrest. Those who pledged loyalty hours before now vanished into the night, leaving only a few devoted figures behind. The room trembled not with cannon fire, but with betrayal. The walls themselves seemed to lean closer, as if to hear the final breaths of men already condemned. Couthon, unable to stand, whispered words of courage, his voice trembling against the knowledge of his fate. Saint-Just, proud and silent, sat like a marble statue, knowing that dawn would not see him free, and at the center Maximilien, pale, exhausted, his sharp features locked in anguish, unable to believe the revolution had abandoned him. The incorruptible voice of France was now a hunted man. The doors shuddered. The building was surrounded. From outside came the crash of weapons, the barking of orders. The city's heart had turned against its own guardians, and the Hôtel de Ville became their tomb. Pistol shot rang out. Maximilien staggered, his jaw torn apart, blood spilling down his chest. The very voice of the revolution silenced in an instant. He collapsed against the table, unable to speak, his eyes wide with pain and disbelief. Augustin saw his brother fall. Desperation seized him. He rushed to the window, the world outside swimming with torches and steel. And in that frantic heartbeat, with no hope left, he leapt. The crowd gasped, the cobblestones waited, and the younger Robespierre hurled himself into the night, choosing the abyss over surrender. Pause a second. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible to see this history connect people across the world. Augustin plunged from the window into the blackness below. For a heartbeat, the city held its breath. Then came the impact. A sickening crack as flesh and bone collided with the unforgiving stone of the courtyard. The sound cut through the night more brutally than any musket fire. He did not die. Instead, he lay twisted upon the cobblestones, his body broken but his mind still trapped within it. His pelvis shattered, his spine crushed, pain radiating through every nerve like fire. Modern medicine would say he had suffered catastrophic fractures, injuries that left him paralyzed yet fully conscious. Every second stretched into an eternity of torment, each shallow breath a knife driven deeper into his chest. From the window above, silence. Inside the Hôtel de Ville, his brother bled in silence, his allies frozen in despair. But outside, the square erupted into chaos. Torches swayed as soldiers surged forward, their boots splashing in the pools of blood. Some shouted in triumph. Others recoiled in horror at the sight of the young Robespierre writhing in agony. The revolution, which prided itself on swift death, had instead delivered a spectacle of drawn-out suffering. Augustin could not stand. He could not run. He could not even raise his voice above a hoarse groan that mingled with the shouts of the mob. He was alive, but every breath was a punishment. Every moment a cruel reminder that death had not yet claimed him. The incorruptible brother lay bleeding upstairs. The loyal brother lay broken in the street. And Paris, restless, hungry for vengeance, roared around them both. You are watching Echoes of Time. Blood soaked through Maximilien's collar as he slumped across the desk, his jaw hanging in a grotesque ruin. Moments before, his words had been his weapon. Speeches that had swayed assemblies, that had summoned death for thousands with nothing more than the rise and fall of his voice. Now that voice was gone. The jaw that once framed thunderous oratory was shattered, leaving him mute, choking on his own blood, reduced to groans that no one could decipher. The silence was more haunting than any scream. The incorruptible leader, the man who demanded virtue from a nation, could no longer plead for himself. His power had evaporated in an instant, not through politics or persuasion, but through the cruel tearing of flesh and bone. The revolution had silenced its loudest prophet, leaving only the sound of dripping blood and muffled breath. Outside, his brother lay broken on the cobblestones, trapped in a body that would no longer obey him. Inside, Maximilien lay broken in spirit, trapped in silence. Two brothers, each destroyed in different ways, yet bound together in suffering. One who could not move, the other who could not speak. Together they embodied the collapse of the revolution's promise. Not a noble martyrdom, but a grotesque parody of it, played out in the darkest hours of Paris. Dragged from the Hôtel de Ville, bloodied and broken, the Robespierre brothers were carried into the tribunal hall. It was called a trial, but nothing of justice lingered there. The verdict had already been written, whispered in the corridors of the convention before the prisoners even arrived. Maximilien, his face bound in a filthy cloth, could not speak a word in his own defense. Augustin, half paralyzed and writhing in pain, could not even rise to meet his accusers. Couthon was hauled in his chair, Saint just stood pale and silent, and around them the gavel fell quickly, mechanically, like the blade that would soon follow. No arguments, no appeals, no chance for salvation. In less than an hour, the tribunal condemned them all. It was not a hearing but a ritual, a sacrifice offered to appease a nation sick of terror and yet still hungry for blood. Here was the revolution, devouring its own architects. The very men who had summoned the guillotine as the tool of justice now found themselves chained to it, swallowed whole by the same machinery of death they once commanded. The line between executioner and victim had vanished, leaving only the endless circle of the blade. You are watching echoes of time. If this kind of truth unsettles you, subscribe now, because history's darkest hours deserve to be remembered, not erased. Dawn broke over Paris on July 28, 1794. The city stirred not with the calm rhythm of a new day, but with the fever of anticipation. The carts rumbled through the streets, their wheels grinding against the stones, carrying not bread, not goods, but men marked for death. In one cart sat Maximilien Robespierre, his face bound in blood-soaked linen, eyes sunken, body trembling, the voice of the revolution silenced forever. Beside him, Augustin lay twisted and broken, unable to sit upright, his shattered bones forcing him to sprawl helplessly as the cart jolted over every rut. Each bump tore fresh groans from his lips, each turn a reminder that death had not yet claimed him. Around them surged the crowd, thousands pressing in, faces alight with a frenzy of relief, vengeance, and awe. Some shouted curses, spitting at the men they once cheered. Others stood hushed, unsettled at the sight of their torment, as though watching the revolution tear out its own beating heart. Children were hoisted onto shoulders, women clutched at each other's arms, men craned their necks for a glimpse of the architects of terror undone. At the Place de la Révolution, the guillotine rose like a black altar. One by one, their allies mounted the scaffold. Couthon carried in his chair, Saint just defiant to the end. Then came the brothers. Augustin first, dragged from the cart, his body too mangled to resist. He was lifted, half-conscious, onto the platform, a broken man displayed before a roaring crowd. The blade fell, and his suffering ended at last. Maximilien followed, pale as death before the blade touched him. The cloth was ripped from his shattered jaw, and he released a sound that was neither word nor scream but the last gasp of a silenced prophet. Moments later, the guillotine claimed him too. The square erupted not in mourning, but in catharsis. The people cheered, shouted, wept, and laughed, tasting both freedom and dread. For in watching the Robespierre brothers die, They saw not just tyrants fall, but the revolution itself devouring its own flesh. The bodies of the Robespierre brothers did not rest in honor. They were stripped of dignity, loaded onto wagons, and carried not to sacred ground, but to the plain earth of the Arances cemetery, a pit for the condemned. There, they were cast among dozens of others, lime poured over their remains to hasten decay, as though even the soil wished to forget them. Years later, the cemetery was emptied, the bones scattered, moved in silence to the catacombs beneath Paris. No marker bore their names, no monument rose to preserve their memory. The men who once shaped the destiny of a nation were reduced to dust in anonymous heaps, indistinguishable from the thousands they had sent before them. History itself seemed to conspire in their erasure. No preserved relics, no honored tombs, no final words carved into stone. The revolution that had crowned them swallowed them whole, leaving only fragments, whispers, shadows, a legacy tainted by blood. Even its leaders were not spared. Even its prophets were forgotten. The guillotine did not end with death. It cut away remembrance itself. You are watching echoes of time. If stories like this remind you how fragile memory can be, subscribe now, so that voices once silenced may still echo through the ages. Two brothers, bound by blood and belief, rose together to shape the destiny of France. They spoke of virtue, of justice, of a new world forged in fire. Yet in the end, they were dragged into the same darkness they had unleashed. One silenced by a shattered jaw, the other broken upon the stones, both erased in unmarked graves. Their enemies tried to bury their memory, to scatter their bones, to strip away their names. But history, relentless and merciless, remembers them still, not as saviors, not as martyrs, but as a warning carved into time itself. Erased yet remembered, destroyed yet never gone. The irony of their fate lingers. The revolution consumed them, and yet it could not silence their echo. You've been watching Echoes of Time. Subscribe to uncover more stories history tried to hide. And if you still won't subscribe, let us know in the comments why. Your voice matters here,